What if a routine police call, a simple report about a $20 bill, could expose the deepest faults in an entire system? What if one man, underestimated and dismissed by those in power, could change the course of history with his last words? Tonight, we dive into the story of George Floyd, the 46-year-old whose life ended in just 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but whose death sparked a global movement. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about one man. It's about power, injustice, and a society forced to confront its own conscience. By the time you reach the end, you'll see how an ordinary life became extraordinary, and why watching, listening, truly matters. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the truth that others tried to hide. It started with a call so small it barely deserved attention. Convenience store, $20 bill, a routine police response. The kind of call that ends with a report and a shrug. George Floyd never imagined it would end his life. On May 25, 2020, in Minneapolis, George Perry Floyd Jr. sat in his car, unaware that a minor suspicion would collide with a system carrying centuries of weight. He was 46 years old, a father, a friend, a man trying to put distance between his past and a future he still believed in. When the police arrived, the power imbalance was immediate. Uniforms, badges, guns, authority backed by policy and precedent. George had none of that. He had his voice, and time, though not much of it. From the first moments, fear crept in. George complied. He spoke softly. He answered questions. Panic trembled in his words, not defiance. He told the officers he was claustrophobic. He begged not to be put in the squad car. Fear, in moments like these, is often misunderstood. George was handcuffed, then pulled down, then pinned to the pavement. A knee pressed into his neck. At first, it looked procedural, temporary, controlled, routine. That's how danger often hides in plain sight. Seconds passed, then minutes. George said the words that would echo across the world. "I can't breathe." Not shouted, not screamed, surrendered. Bystanders gathered. Phones came out. Voices rose. Not angry, but alarmed. "He's not resisting. You're hurting him. Check his pulse." George cried out for his mother. His voice weakened. His body stopped moving. And still the knee stayed. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Not chaos. Not confusion. Sustained pressure. Applied in daylight, in public, with witnesses begging for it to stop. George Floyd died on the street. For decades, stories like this ended quietly. An internal review, a statement, a promise to investigate, then silence. But this time, the silence didn't hold. The video escaped, spread, crossed borders and languages and excuses. There was no angle that softened it, no context that explained it away. A man pleading for air. An officer refusing to move. The underdog, long dismissed, was undeniable. Outrage followed. Minneapolis first, then the nation, then the world. People who had never known George Floyd's name now carried it on signs. Streets filled. Voices rose. Not just for one man, but for a pattern that had repeated too many times, always with the same ending. And yet, skepticism lingered. Charges don't always mean convictions. Trials don't always mean accountability. Power has a way of protecting itself. Still, something felt different. The evidence was undeniable. The timeline unforgiving. The final stillness absolute. Derek Chauvin, the officer with his knee on George's neck, was arrested and charged. For the first time, the possibility of justice felt real. The trial in 2021 became a national reckoning. Inside the courtroom, Chauvin sat composed, quiet, controlled, familiar with a system that had long worked in his favor. George Floyd was present only through video. His final minutes replayed again and again. The defense pointed everywhere but the knee. Drugs, health conditions, crowds. The prosecution focused on oxygen deprivation, on cause and effect, on a simple truth. George Floyd died because pressure cut off his air. Then came the moment that changed everything. Police officers testified against one of their own. They said the force was excessive. They said it violated training. They said it should have stopped. The blue wall cracked. The power shifted. What had once been untouchable was now on trial. When the jury returned, the room tightened. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Second-degree murder. Third-degree murder. Manslaughter. For a moment, there was silence, followed not by celebration but by release. Tears. Exhalations. A feeling many had never known in cases like this. Justice, real, recorded, undeniable, had been served. Derek Chauvin was later sentenced to over 20 years in prison. A powerful figure fell, not through chaos or revenge, but through evidence and the refusal to look away. George Floyd did not live to see it, but his name reshaped the world. Here is the irony that cuts deepest. George Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit bill, but it was the promise of equal justice that had been counterfeit for generations. And for once, it was exposed. George was underestimated in life, seen as disposable, suspicious, forgettable. In death, he became undeniable. His final words crossed borders. His story forced conversations power had long avoided. The underdog did not win by strength. He won by truth. The lesson is not comfortable. Justice does not arrive on its own. It is demanded, documented, defended. George Floyd's death did not fix policing, did not erase bias, did not end injustice, but it proved something many believed was impossible. Accountability can happen, and once people see that, they never unsee it. Yet the story does not end here, because George Floyd was not the first, and he may not be the last. Reforms were promised, some delivered, others resisted. Power adapts, systems test their limits. In Part 2, we'll examine what changed, and what quietly didn't after the verdict. The backlash, the reforms, the reversals, and the question that still hangs in the air. Was this a turning point, or an exception? Because justice, once served, must be protected. And the world is still watching. Fade to black, the verdict was read, the gavel fell, and for a brief moment the world exhaled. Justice had spoken clearly, something many believed they would never witness. Derek Chauvin was led away in handcuffs, not shielded by the system that had protected officers for decades, but judged by it. Headlines called it a turning point. Commentators declared history made. Streets filled again, this time with relief instead of rage. But justice in America has a habit of being loud at the moment of arrival, and quiet in what follows. The question wasn't whether George Floyd's case mattered. The question was whether it would last. In the weeks after the verdict, cities promised change. Police departments announced reforms. Body cameras were expanded. Training manuals were rewritten. Words like accountability, equity, and reimagining policing flooded press conferences. But on the ground, where power actually lives, resistance was already forming. Unions pushed back. Lawsuits followed. Politicians softened their language. The system, wounded but not defeated, began to recalibrate. Across the country, police budgets quietly grew again. Qualified immunity, long criticized as a shield against consequences, remained largely intact. New policies were introduced, but enforcement was uneven. George Floyd's name was invoked often, but not always honored. And then came the backlash. Protests were reframed as riots. Reform was recast as anti-police sentiment. Fear replaced empathy in the national conversation. Some states passed laws increasing penalties for protesters. Others restricted how police misconduct could be investigated. The same streets that once echoed with "I can't breathe" now heard a different refrain: "Move on." But communities most affected by police violence couldn't move on. For them, George Floyd wasn't a chapter. It was confirmation. Confirmation of stories told for generations and dismissed as exaggeration. Mothers who warned their sons how to survive traffic stops. Fathers who taught compliance as a form of self-preservation. George Floyd's death validated their fear in the most public way possible. And yet something had changed. Officers were watching themselves. Cameras were everywhere. Citizens were no longer silent witnesses. They were documentarians. A phone in a pocket had become a tool of accountability. That shift mattered. Prosecutors noticed. Departments noticed. Power noticed. In Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd took his final breath, voters were asked whether to dismantle and rebuild the police department entirely. The measure failed, but the fact that it reached a ballot at all was unthinkable just years earlier. Elsewhere, consent decrees were revisited. Federal investigations reopened. Patterns that had once been buried were now examined line by line. Derek Chauvin's conviction did something rare. It made consequences feel possible. But justice is not only about punishment. It's about prevention. And here the record is complicated. Police killings did not stop. Names continued to surface. Some cases gained attention. Many did not. The spotlight moved quickly, as it always does. That is how systems survive, by waiting for fatigue. Still, the Floyd case left scars on policing culture. Officers testified later that they felt watched, restrained, uncertain. Some resigned. Others doubled down. Recruitment fell. Morale dropped. Critics argued reform had gone too far. Supporters argued it hadn't gone far enough. The nation stood divided, staring at the same evidence, reaching different conclusions. George Floyd became more than a man. He became a symbol. Symbols are powerful, but they are also dangerous. They can inspire change, or they can be used as placeholders for it. Streets were renamed. Murals painted. Moments of silence observed. Yet families continued to bury loved ones. The irony remained sharp. Justice for George Floyd was real, but justice for everyone was still conditional. And then came sentencing. Derek Chauvin received over 20 years in prison. Later, a federal sentence added more time. The message was unmistakable. This was not a slap on the wrist. This was accountability at its harshest. For supporters, it was validation. For skeptics, it was an anomaly. One conviction does not dismantle a system built over centuries. But it does crack it, and cracks let light in. The power shift was subtle but undeniable. Police departments began to understand that cameras don't just protect officers, they expose them. Prosecutors learned juries would no longer accept vague explanations over clear video. The public learned its voice mattered, but only if it stayed loud. And that may be George Floyd's lasting legacy. Not that justice was served once, but that people learned it could be demanded again. The lesson is unfinished. Justice is not a destination. It's a fight that requires memory. When names fade, systems reset. When stories are forgotten, patterns return. George Floyd's story forces a choice. Remember or repeat. As time moves forward, the danger isn't outrage. It's indifference. Because the next minor call is already happening somewhere. Another routine stop. Another moment of unchecked power. Another life hanging in the balance. The question is no longer whether justice is possible. We've seen that it is. The question is whether the public will insist on it every time. Not just when the cameras roll, not just when the name trends, but when it's uncomfortable, inconvenient, and exhausting. In Part 3, we'll follow the ripple effects beyond the courtroom. How this case reshaped global protests, influenced new laws, and why some experts believe the most critical changes are still ahead, or already being rolled back. If you want to understand where justice is heading, and what's quietly happening behind the scenes, make sure you're subscribed. Because stories like this don't end with a verdict. They end with what we choose to remember. The cameras moved on, but the consequences did not. In the months after the world watched George Floyd die, something quieter began to unfold. Less visible than protests, less dramatic than a verdict, but far more revealing. Power once challenged does not disappear. It adapts. While public attention shifted to the next crisis, institutions began recalculating what accountability would look like when no one was watching. Globally, George Floyd's name had already crossed borders. From London to Lagos, from Paris to Sydney, millions marched not just for one man, but for a shared recognition of unchecked authority. Police departments around the world reviewed use of force policies. Some banned chokeholds outright. Others promised transparency. For a moment, it felt like a reckoning without borders. But reform is easiest to announce when pressure is high. It's hardest to sustain when attention fades. In the United States, Congress debated sweeping police reform legislation bearing George Floyd's name. It promised national standards, limits on qualified immunity, and federal oversight. It passed the House. It stalled in the Senate. Negotiations collapsed. Compromise replaced courage. And quietly, the most ambitious federal reform effort in decades died without a vote. The public barely noticed. Meanwhile, states went their own way. Some enacted stronger accountability laws. Others expanded police protections. The country fractured into different interpretations of justice, depending on geography. In some cities, civilian oversight gained teeth. In others, oversight boards were stripped of power. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Systems under pressure don't resist directly. They wait. They redirect. They reframe the narrative. Public safety became the new shield. Rising crime statistics, often complex and selectively presented, were used to argue that reform had gone too far. That accountability had made officers hesitant. That fear, not policy, was now the real danger. The story subtly shifted. George Floyd was no longer the center. Disorder was. And in that shift, power regained its footing. Police unions, once on the defensive, reasserted influence. Contracts were renegotiated. Arbitration clauses quietly reinstated fired officers. Training budgets increased without corresponding oversight. The machine learned from its mistake, not to change, but to protect itself more carefully. Yet something fundamental had altered. The public had seen behind the curtain. They had watched a system fail in real time, and then, rarely, hold one of its own accountable. That memory lingered. Jurors carried it into courtrooms across the country. Prosecutors referenced it cautiously. Defense strategies changed. The phrase "reasonable fear" was no longer accepted without scrutiny. Video evidence became king. And officers knew it. You could see it in body cam footage. Pauses, reassessments, hands lifting slightly before force was used. Small changes, human ones, proof that observation alters behavior. George Floyd's death also changed how victims were heard. Families once dismissed as emotional were now recognized as essential witnesses to systemic failure. Civil lawsuits resulted in historic settlements. Cities paid not just with money, but with admissions of wrongdoing. That mattered, created paper trails, precedents, records that could not be erased. Still, the cost was heavy. Police staffing shortages hit hardest in communities already over-policed and underprotected. Trust eroded on both sides. Officers felt vilified. Residents felt abandoned. The space between them widened, filled with resentment and fear. This is where true reform either takes root or dies. Not in moments of outrage, but in periods of exhaustion. George Floyd's story revealed an uncomfortable truth. Justice achieved once can convince society the work is done. But justice delayed for others tells a different story. New names emerged. Some sparked brief outrage. Most did not. Algorithms decide visibility now. Attention is currency. And without it, accountability weakens. That is the system's greatest defense. Not brutality, but boredom. Yet even here, George Floyd's case cast a long shadow. International human rights organizations cited it as evidence of structural abuse. Law schools rewrote case studies. Police academies used the footage as instruction, not always as condemnation, but as caution. A generation of officers will be trained with this moment as reference. That matters more than any headline. Derek Chauvin will spend decades in prison. That fact alone reshaped expectations. Officers now know prison is possible. Not guaranteed, not common, but possible. And possibility changes calculations. The power shift, though incomplete, is real. It lives in hesitation, in policy footnotes, in courtroom arguments that no longer assume immunity. The life lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Systems do not change because they are convinced. They change because they are compelled. George Floyd did not set out to expose anything. He did not choose to become a symbol. He was an underdog in the purest sense. A man with a complicated past, no power, no protection, caught in a moment where authority decided his life was disposable. That is why his story endures. Not because it was unique, but because it was recognizable. And that recognition forced a choice. Look away or look closer. The future of justice depends on which choice is made repeatedly, long after the chants fade. Because the real test was never the verdict. It was what came after. And that test is still ongoing. Somewhere right now, another minor call is being answered. Another uniform stepping into a moment of decision. Another chance for power to choose restraint or dominance. We don't know how that moment will end. But we know this. History is watching now, even when cameras aren't. And if part 1 was exposure and part 2 was accountability, then part 4 will confront the hardest question of all. Whether justice can survive without outrage to fuel it, or whether this case will become another lesson learned too briefly. If you want to understand where this path leads, and why the next chapter may already be unfolding, stay with us. Subscribe. Because the most dangerous moments in true crime are not the ones caught on camera. They're the ones that happen after the world stops looking. Justice for George Floyd was achieved in court, but the story didn't end there. The lesson is hard, uncomfortably clear. Systems do not change on their own. Change happens when people pay attention, when they refuse to stay silent, when they insist on accountability even when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unpopular. George Floyd's death reminded the world that no one is untouchable, but also that power, when unchecked, will always test its limits. His life, and the life of every underdog who has ever been dismissed or underestimated, forces us to ask ourselves, will we watch quietly or will we act? Will we demand justice when it's inconvenient, when it challenges the powerful, when it tests the system itself? The global outcry, the protests, the policy discussions, they were all signs that one man's story could awaken a world to injustice. But the truth is, the fight isn't over. Police reform is incomplete. Inequality still persists. And the next minor call could be the beginning of another tragedy if the lessons aren't remembered. George Floyd's story teaches us that change begins with awareness, grows with action, and survives only when we refuse to look away. So, if you believe in the power of truth, if you want to witness stories that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world, and if you refuse to let injustice be ignored, make sure you subscribe now. Turn on notifications because this is more than history. It's a guide for holding power accountable, for demanding justice, and for making sure the voices of the underdog are never silenced again. George Floyd's life, his death, and the movement he inspired will not be forgotten, and neither should we. Subscribe today, and join us as we continue to uncover the stories that others try to hide, reveal the truths that the powerful hope we ignore, and follow the paths where justice can and must be demanded. The story doesn't end here, because real justice never does.